Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Sheviit. We are up to Perek Gimel, Mishnah Tet. Today's Mishnah should be Leilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Arenbai, Menuchato Began Eden, Amen. We learned in the previous Mishnah Rabotai that a person is not allowed to take stones from his own field on Shemitah unless he fulfills certain conditions. Why? Because he's going to be suspected of clearing the ground for planting, which is obviously asur. Now, this isur only applies when these stones are small. But if you remove large stones, which the Mishnah is going to call shoulder stones, that would be allowed in all situations. Avnei chatef ba'ot mikol makom. Shoulder stones can be brought from any place, even one's own field. And the Mepharshim explain what are shoulder stones. Shoulder stones are large stones that are used as construction material. So if a person removes them from his field, people are going to assume you're taking it for construction and not to clear the field for planting. Now, even though we know that generally you cannot remove stones from the quarry, which is the mass of big stone that you chop off stones from, or a stone fence from your own land, and it's not permitted unless it's in somebody else's field, removing shoulder stones, this large stone, is allowed even from your own field. The Mishnah continues, "Vakablan mevi mikol makom," and a building contractor can bring all types of stones from any place, even his own field, because since a professional builder uses stones of any size for his work, he's not going to arouse any suspicion. Now, in the previous Mishnah, when we said that a person who's building a wall can take small stones only if they're within your arm's reach, that was not referring to a professional builder, because a professional builder can take small stones even when he is not building, because people will know that he's taking it for building purposes. The Eluhen of Nechatef, and the Mishnah now translates, these are what shoulder stones are. Kol she'ena yechula linatel ba'achat yad. Any stone that is so large it cannot be carried in one hand, but has to be carried in two hands or on one shoulder. Divrei Rabbi Meir, these are the words of Rabbi Meir, that this is what a shoulder stone is. Rabbi Yossi Omer, but Rabbi Yossi disagrees. He says, Avnei chatef kishman. Shoulder stones are implied by their name, plural, stones, not one large stone. Kol shenitalot shtayim shalosh al katef. So it's referring to what are shoulder stones? Any stones that are carried 2 or 3 at a time on the shoulder. The Mepharshim explain that according to Rabbi Yossi, they're too large to be carried in one hand, but they're small enough to be carried 2 or 3 at a time on a man's shoulder. So Rabbi Yossi says, even though these stones are not very large, a person can remove them from his field on Shemitah, whereas Rabbi Meir only allows you to remove a stone if it is so big that it takes a man's entire strength to carry one of them, either on your shoulder or on both hands. And the Rab tells us, Halakha Rabbi Yossi, the Halakha follows Rabbi Yossi's view. That is in Abotai Mishnah Tet. Mishnah Yud now is going to discuss different issues that arise when a person builds a wall between his property and a street or another public area. Haboneh gader beno ben reshut harabim. If somebody wants to build a wall between his field and a public domain, and he has to dig a foundation for it, mutar la'amik ad hasela, he is allowed to dig down as far as the bedrock, meaning you are allowed to dig this on Shemitah, even though it's making the land fit for planting, because he's unlikely to change his mind and decide to plant in the area instead of building the wall. And the Mepharshim explain why. Because people generally don't want to plant in areas next to public domain, because the growths are going to be trampled by people that are walking by. Therefore, when you dig next to a public domain for the purpose of building a wall, that is allowed, because most probably the digger is not going to change his mind and choose to plant there instead. But when you dig next to private land, that is asur, because in that case, the person might actually change his mind, and when he sees the land dug up and he's going to want to use it for planting, and that's why that would be asur. Now, the Mishnah continues to discuss how this person should deal with the earth that he dug up, meaning you dug up earth, right? He cannot dump it on his own field, because that looks like you're trying to spread topsoil to prepare the ground for planting. Instead, he has to put it somewhere else. And the Mishnah says, "Ma ye'aseh be'afar." What does he do with the earth that he dug? Sovro b'rshut harabim. He piles it up in the public domain. Umtakno. And later on, he's going to fix the public domain by removing the earth and putting it somewhere else. And the Mepharshim tell us that at this point, Tvelt Yisrael writes, he can even put the earth back on his field. Why? Because in that case, he's not putting the earth in order to put the soil over the land. Rather, he's doing it to prevent harm from people on public property. Div Rabbi Yeshua, these are the words of Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Akiva Omer, but Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He says, just like a person cannot damage a public domain by making a pile of earth there, even though he's going to remove it afterwards, so too he cannot repair a public domain by collecting dirt that is already there and heaping it into a pile, even if he's going to leave it there for a short time. Basically, the Rab tells us that Rabbi Akiva forbids making a pile of dirt in the public area, even if you intend to remove it right away. Why? Because a pile of dirt is damaging and harmful in the place used by the public. Also, Rabbi Akiva says that this issur not only does it apply when you're dumping earth from your land into the street, but even when you're cleaning the street by piling up dirt that's already there. For example, if there are stones or dirt scattered in the street, a person is not allowed to pile them up at the side of the street and leave the pile there for any amount of time. Rather, he has to immediately remove all the stones and dirt that he gathered and dispose of them in the river or in the sea. So, what is then this person who's digging on Shemitah to build a wall? What does he do with the earth? What does he do with the earth if he cannot throw it in Reshut HaRabim? Rabbi Akiva says you have to pile it up in your field the same way like those people pile up manure in their fields are allowed to do, which is you make 3 piles of 3 lesech, each per bet se'ah. Like we said earlier in Mishnah Bet, a person is allowed to heap manure in his field as long as he makes no more than 3 piles per bet se'ah, and each pile contains at least 3 lesech. Why? Because when you make a few large piles, instead of spreading it over the ground, you're showing that you're not using it to fertilize your field, but you're storing it until the next year. So same thing here. When you heap the earth in 3 large piles, you avoid giving the impression that you're spreading it over the field as topsoil. Now, this machloket between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Akiva applies to digging near a public domain, even when it's not Shemitah. The same dispute applies when a person wants to dig a round pit, a ditch, which is a long, narrow pit, or a vault, which is a pit covered with a roof in which there is an opening. Now, next to a public area in a regular non-Shemitah year. And the Rav tells us that according to Rabbi Yeshua, as you dig up the earth, he can make piles of it in public domain as long as he removes them when he finishes and restores the public domain back to its original condition. But according to Rabbi Akiva, he has to keep the earth in his own land and he cannot dump it into the public domain even for a short time. And the Rab tells us, halakha ki Rabbi Akiva, the halakha follows Rabbi Akiva, that af al pi sheda'ato letaken asur elat sobro birshuto. Even though you intend to fix the public domain later, you are not allowed to dump it there. You have to keep it in your own land. And that is then, Rabotai, today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen v'amen.